Coming up on Regarding Men, Women, Relationships, and the Victim Mentality. Welcome to Regarding Men, a place where we hold men in high regard. And that's an unusual place these days, but that is certainly the place we are, and a place where red pill isolation comes to die. A quick and beautiful death, actually. Come see us at regardingmen.com/join. Anyway, I'm joined today with Janice Fiamengo and Paul Elam, my two favorite men's advocates, and I'm Tom Golden. And we're here to talk about something really important and unusual. We're going to talk about victimhood. Anybody seeing much of victimhood these days? Man, Paul hasn't seen any. Janice is just smiling. Man, it's all over the place. I mean, the whole social justice warrior thing is packed with victimhood. Trying to be the biggest victim you can be. The whole identity politics thing is victimhood, trying to be the biggest thing you can be. And it's like, the narcissism and the victimhood is just growing and growing and growing. It seems like it's been growing since what? Since the 1980s. Even the 70s, when we had much more of a sense then of a culture as the default being, you try hard, you work at it, and you get things done. And if there's a problem, you work at it. Now it's like, if there's a problem, you complain about it. And you're a victim. And the more a victim you are, the more power you're going to get. I mean, how crazy is that crap? Absolutely crazy. And so that's why Paul, Janice, and myself were all stunned to see the following article. Look at this. Self-victimhood is a personality type, researchers find. Look at her there. She's unhappy. But think about it. Self-victimhood is a personality type, researchers find. And let's talk about that. What do you guys think about that?
Well, when I said I hadn't seen any victims, I was lying. Like that kid in The Sixth Sense, I see victims everywhere.
Yes.
And we do. And unfortunately, what we live in is, I think, a victim culture.
Yes.
The article talks about this sort of along the lines of a personality trait or perhaps a disorder. It does distinguish. It says in the article that this is separate from narcissism. I don't know if I'm buying that. These things tend to have a lot of overlap in between narcissism, borderline, and these sort of personality traits. But what made me think about more than anything else when I saw this study was the work that I did in chemical dependency treatment centers with family members. And just to sort of set up the scenario, what we would see, of course, is usually a guy identified as the problem in the family with the alcohol or drug problem, because that is proportionally, that's the way it works out. It's mostly men. And so we have mostly female family members, wives, and other significant people to the family come in and participate in part of the treatment. And what I would see over and over and over again is wives martyring themselves for the group interaction. They would describe their lives somewhat as a martyr. And I sacrificed everything for him. And I called the boss when he was too drunk to go to work. And I protected the children from seeing him when he was passed out on the floor. And poor me, poor me, poor me. And there was a lot of reinforcement from other group members for that and from other clinicians, because yes, this is good. You need to get this out. You need to talk about this. But the moment that you challenge those individuals saying, well, did you leave? You say the kids were threatened by his drug abuse. Did you take them out of the scene? Did you protect them? Suddenly the tears would dry up. And here comes the anger. How dare you question me? I'm the victim here. And so the assertion was that anything other than the victim role for the codependent in the relationship wasn't acceptable.
Right.
They could not have agency. They could not be responsible for decisions. And look, I get it. I watched for 30 years in treatment centers, and I saw the tatters that living with alcoholic and drug addicts inflicts on the lives of families. It's devastating. It is absolutely devastating. But the victims, the so-called victims in that matter, unless their children participated in this. And this is what I see. I like the term, there's no victims, only volunteers. And of course, this research points us in a direction that I think is helpful for men in understanding women in a different way. That's sort of part two of this, is that, you know, I don't buy men being victims either. And I certainly, I get emails from men who say, no matter what I did, it wasn't good enough. I tried my best in the relationship. Did you leave? Nope. All of a sudden, they don't want to talk to me anymore. So you get the same kind of behavior, but I do think this is more common in women. And I think this serves as a good set of red flags that if you meet somebody, guys, and in the first 10 minutes, you're hearing about their childhood trauma or their last bad relationship, they are setting themselves up as a victim. And the only thing that fits on the other side of a victim is a perpetrator. Victims need a perpetrator to maintain their identity. And that would be you. So when you see this stuff come out early in relationships, I'm arguing this is a great time for guys to take responsibility for what's right in front of their face. And if you have somebody coming out and saying, hi, my name's Jane, and my father sexually abused me, run like the wind. Because look, none of this is new. I'm glad they finally put it in research, but none of this is new. This has been going on, I would argue, for a long, long time in the human experience. And we're just now finding a way to sort of codify it and give it names.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because that's what I found too, reading the article and reading the study on which the article was based. It's very familiar, and I'm sure many people who are watching this are going to be able to identify the specific characteristics that the study picks out as part of this personality type. And they'll, oh yeah, right, I could see that, I could see that, I could see that, I would have predicted that. I mean, if you look up on even, Wikipedia, something like victim mentality disorder, I think it already exists as an identifiable personality disorder. But what I found, I mean, and it's been known amongst the general populace, I think, for a long time, as you say, Paul, but what I found really interesting about the article and the study is that, like, it really very specifically codifies particular aspects of that personality type that I don't think are there in the general idea of victim mentality disorder, which just stresses the need that some people tend to have to see themselves as victims. But this actually outlines the major qualities of it. And I found that really interesting, especially the lack of empathy for others, the moral elitism, the belief in oneself as superior and as morally pristine, the tendency to rationalize aggressive behavior, therefore, on one's own or one's group's part against the perceived enemy, the treasuring up, the what they call rumination. Like they give all these particular characteristics that are so helpful to have.
Yes, and important for us. And they also talk about a need for vengeance.
Yeah,
this is a need for vengeance, which, boy, you can see that in spades. This research
and what's
article.
the best way to get vengeance for many people who identify as victims? It's through an accusation.
Yeah,
you get to reinforce the victim narrative and get vengeance at the same time, simply by pointing a finger. You guys who have had this happen to you, this probably sounds quite familiar.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know that anyone will be particularly surprised, except that this research by these researchers actually made it into a major personality journal and is being, recognized and given scholarly credence. I'm surprised by that,
I am
actually. I
too.
mean,
I am
that's
too.
major. This isn't just us speaking about it in general terms. This is a group of academics publishing this material and therefore having it out there in the scholarly world, and it's very meticulously presented. So yeah, that it's I'm actually surprised that the vetters allowed this to make it into print in a way. It's a devastating indictment of a huge swath of our culture that is now deeply entrenched, both in the general society and in academia itself.
Yeah, the thing that's important to me is that this study pathologizes what we're seeing.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
says victimhood is a pathology. If
yeah.
you think you're a victim too much, then there's something wrong with you. I mean, when I read that, I went, yes, yes, it is so true. And these
Yeah,
people who are addicted to this victim role are just
yeah,
incredibly insensitive to any alternatives. Like Paul's story about, they get angry if you're questioned. And that's a
yeah.
part of what this study said. Let's look at there's the study right there, and it
Yeah.
was in the Personality and Individual Differences Journal in 2020 of May. So these guys get my vote for bravery.
Yeah.
And
Are
heads
in,
may yet roll.
yeah, yeah. We'll see what kind of comments they get to this. It'll be actually quite interesting to see what they get. But these people were. I mean, they're brave as far as I'm concerned. I mean,
Well, they're putting a name to something that in general, well, they're not only putting a name, but they're giving a very detailed outline to help people identify something that in general terms is just accepted as a reality. That,
yes,
oh yes,
yes,
you are a victim, and we dare not question any aspect of your self-perception, your perception of the world, or your behavior as a result. And these guys are saying, no way, like this is a major disorder, and it leads to egregious misbehavior and misperception, and it needs to be identified and hopefully treated. I mean, that's,
yes.
yeah, really, really useful to us.
And the implication is it's toxic for relationships.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
they don't say
exactly.
that exactly, but I mean, it's obvious from reading it that they understand that this is not something that's going to help a relationship. This is something that's going to hurt it in a big way.
And, it really makes you wonder, though. I mean, how much would the average licensed marriage and family therapist embrace this information? Because what we see
Yeah,
in their work so often is they literally collude with the wife,
yeah,
Yeah, I've seen
and,
that.
who is playing the victim,
Yeah,
and they reinforce that. I mean, this is something that should cut into clinical work very deeply for
yeah.
a lot of therapists. But I'm thinking, what is the dissonance that's created when you've got this study that just lays this stuff out so perfectly, and then you've got a whole profession that makes their bread and butter off of perpetuating
Well,
victimhood.
there is no
yeah.
dissonance. There is no dissonance because the grad schools are only teaching one thing. They're not going to
Yep.
teach this study. They're not going to teach precarious manhood or the newest stuff on testosterone or the moral typecasting stuff. I mean, these are things that every therapist should know. And in
Yeah.
fact, every person should know about this, just to be able
Yeah.
to relate to each other. But they're not, and that's why we have a problem, is they are so one-sided. They're Mobius strips. These graduate schools are
Yeah.
Mobius strips. They're only telling one side of the story. And that's the chivalric side. Oh, well, let's be chivalrous
Yeah.
to the victim. Let's help them.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Well, that's for sure. And although even, I mean, you know, I had a friend who went to therapy for years, and this was a male friend. Now, this was many years ago, so it may have changed since then. He did not come out, you know, feeling that he had to apologize for his male privilege. He was not asked to, you know, examine his toxicity as a man, which he might well have been now if he were doing it. But
Yes.
what I did notice then, this is like way back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. But what I did notice was that notion of the victimized self was very much reinforced even in that case, where it seemed like he went to therapy for years. Literally, he was not somebody who had you know, suffered a serious trauma or anything like that. But what I noticed was that the therapy not only didn't seem to help him, but actually seemed to make things worse, in that his therapist affirmed all his sense of the world as being stacked against him, and as nothing really being his fault, and as other people deserving blame. And, you know, all the kinds of things that this study talks about as elements of the tendency to interpersonal victimhood. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right, both of you. I think that therapy has been pushing this, confirming it, building a whole institutional structure around it for decades. So yes. This really throws a wrench into everything.
It really does. It really does. And we will definitely leave a link to this one below so you can read both the article and the study itself.
Mm-hmm. Can we go through, Tom, some of the elements of the personality construct that are identified?
Yeah, sure. You want to do that?
They're pretty interesting.
Do you have it handy? Or would you like me to read it?
I know what they are. I've written them down. Maybe should we just identify what they are then?
Because I've got it here in front of me. I can read out what they said if you want.
Okay, yeah, do please.
Okay. The first is, the need for recognition refers to victims' motivation to have their victimhood acknowledged and empathized with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
I thought that was fascinating.
You better have someone who's going to have empathy with you. Mm-hmm. It's like Paul was talking about it. As soon as you say, well, why didn't you act in this way? You're not giving me empathy. I'm only to get this side. I'm only to get empathy. So that was the first construct.
Mm-hmm. And I thought that was fascinating because it's that, you know, it's something that, you know, I'm sure all of us have noticed about individuals, and even now we can say like social groups, whatever the subject, whatever is being addressed, whatever is going on, the victimhood always has to be affirmed. So if, you know, a virus begins to spread around the entire world, what do we hear from feminist groups, for example? We hear that women are the worst affected, even when the early information was that men were dying in vastly disproportionate numbers, but we still had to hear about how women were worst affected. Then we heard for some long period of time about how visible minorities were worst affected, and that needed to be on the forefront of everybody's consciousness. We can never, it seems, in our world as it is now constituted, we can never forget the existence of these victim groups who always claim that their suffering deserves attention, that their suffering is all that really matters, and that everything else has to be forgotten about. It's the case where the victimhood becomes the primary identity of the person, and it dwarfs every other consideration. And I thought that really comes across well in this study.
Yes. And then number 2 is, they talk about moral elitism. This is interesting.
That's familiar.
Moral elitism refers to the perception of immaculate morality of the self. In other words, my morality is immaculate, and the immorality of the other side.
Mm-hmm.
Have we seen that before?
Yeah. Wow.
Well, I'll point this out, and it'll probably piss off a few people that attend like ACA and CODA and other related 12-step meetings. Mm-hmm. My observation of those meetings, for the most part, is they are a bunch of broken people coming together to hide behind their moral elitism.
Yeah.
That's what I see over and over in those circumstances, is people portraying themselves as martyrs and saints, and making a big show of finally learning how to take care of themselves, which, believe me, most of them been taking care of themselves pretty damn well in a lot of dysfunctional ways.
Yeah.
But I see that in those programs over and over and over again, and it makes me sad to see it, because there is absolutely help to be had for these things, but not you can't get help if you've got to hang on to the identity of a victim. We saw it for years in the 80s. Tom, you remember the I'm a survivor t-shirts that's so common to the therapeutic. Those t-shirts should have said I'm a victim, because that's what they're really saying.
Right.
They're not survivors, they're victims. And they're hanging on to that identity even through their apparel through life. It's absolutely insane.
Yeah, I always cringed when people would talk about I'm a survivor. Because, what? Survivor? How about you're a person?
Yeah, if you walk out of a bad car wreck, you're a survivor.
That's true. Yeah. And then the next one is, so that one says, my morality is immaculate, yours sucks.
Yeah.
The next one says, a lack of empathy. Lack of empathy refers to an oblivious reaction to others in general and to their suffering in particular.
Yeah. And that is, it's the kiss of death to any individual or group trying to improve one's situation, addressing any real grievance or social injustice. As soon as you make moral indignation and hatred of others the ground of your personal identity or of your collective identity, it's a recipe for disaster. And it's one of the things that I really like about the men's rights movement in general, which is that a lot of us are very angry about specific situations that have been created for men in our society. And we do feel that there is serious injustice, but hating on women has not become part of the men's rights movement.
Right.
I have yet to meet a man who says, I hate women, they're all cruel. Most men that I talk to about their situation, even men that have suffered egregiously in a family courts or through a false accusation, just want it all to end. They don't hate women. They don't want to take revenge on women. They don't make mass generalizations about female evil. They talk about specific things that are wrong in our system, how they could be fixed, and how they want to make everything better for everybody so that families can be healthier, men and women can have a better relationship, the trust and the liking, the amity between men and women can be restored, that kind of thing. And that is, I think, so important, that you not allow hatred to dominate either your personal psychology or the psychology of your movement. And unfortunately, when you adopt this, TIF, the tendency for interpersonal victimhood, hatred of the other and an inability to empathize with the other and a belief that the other can't really suffer at all, that becomes a integral part of your identity.
Right. And men in general, I think, have avoided this in some ways, because if you look at what happens in divorce, so often what I see with men in divorce is they say, well, I'll give her a little bit more. I'll give her more than this, just to, maybe that'll help. Maybe that'll make things better. And that's their general mistake. And then later they go, damn, why did I do that? But they're trying to make things better. They're not trying to get vengeance. They're not saying, I'm going to get her. I'm going to get that bitch. They're saying, oh, well, maybe if I give her this, things would get better.
Well, what men do, and it's a fatal mistake, is they say, maybe if I treat her with fairness and kindness in this, she will reciprocate that.
And treat me back in the same way.
If you're doing that with a chronic victim, they are not going to reciprocate. I think that's one of the really important points about all this, is that guys need to realize, one, that these individuals who identify primarily as victims in life, they're dangerous.
Yes.
They are dangerous.
Yes, exactly.
Your well-being in every way possible. And you need to understand that. The other thing that I want to pick up on something Janice said, which is so true about the men's rights movement. what most men, sure, a lot of guys come into the movement and they're angry when they get there. They're pulling knives out of their back, so they're spewing some bile and venting and getting some stuff off their chest.
Yes.
But what men come to after time in this movement is that they're not victims. That's the whole point.
Yes.
Is that men can protect themselves with their decisions, and that's something, unfortunately, that the mental health professions have refused to teach women. That they can change their lives with decisions, that they can live better lives, which they absolutely can if they pick different people and such. But yeah, that's absolutely true. We're not a movement of victims, and for that I am very grateful. I couldn't be a part of it if it was a movement.
Exactly.
Because it's not healthy.
That's right.
Well, I think there's I was just going to say, I think there's a distinction between having been victimized by a particular, situation and seeing yourself as a victim, like assuming victimhood as your identity. And I've met a lot of men who were victimized. Wow. I mean, it was incredible what happened to them. But our movement is not about affirming people's sense of themselves as victims, as their primary core identity. And that's the thing that this study really zeroes in on. And what I was so struck by, I mean, it was the thing that actually turned me off feminism, was that because at first, of course, as everybody knows, I think who's listened to any of my interviews, I was quite attracted to the story that feminism tells, except at some point I realized, hold on, like, I don't see myself, I don't primarily identify myself as a victim of misogyny or whatever. I mean, I identify myself in all sorts of ways, as a daughter, as a wife, as a teacher, as an animal lover. I don't want to make victimhood the ground of my identity. And that's what's so wrong with feminism and various other social justice movements, is that it does want to make victimhood the ground of one's identity. And I don't see that in men who are interested in men's rights.
Correct. Yeah, I don't see it either. And I think one of the most important things this study has done is it has linked the idea of being a victim with the idea of taking vengeance.
Yeah.
And that's where it makes it dangerous. And that's what we need to understand, is that if you see someone with TIV, and I love that TIV, we're going to use this for a long time. Yeah. But if you see someone with this TIV, they're dangerous. These people are dangerous. And the research is telling you that. So that's very different from what we've seen before.
Exactly.
God love them.
Well, in fact, in our culture now, I would say it's the opposite. Our culture tends to think that victims are actually better than other people. The victim believes that I suffer, therefore I'm better. And our society affirms that. And in fact, we have this idea that victims have more empathy for others because they've suffered, and that we should put them in positions of power because they've suffered, and therefore they have this deep understanding that supposedly other people don't have, and this ability to relate to other people. And this study is saying it's the opposite. They don't have a deeper understanding, and in fact they have a total lack of empathy for others. They deny that others suffer at all.
By definition. They're saying that.
And they feel morally justified in inflicting harm on people that they can cast as perpetrators in any way, whether it is the individuals in their life one-on-one, or whether it is groups of people in society in general. It's how we get so much unabashed man-hating out of feminists, is because they feel justified in their hatred. And of course, it's an absolute sickness. It's a mental defect that we're seeing at play, but they don't realize it, and neither does the mental health establishment.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's right.
In fact, they perpetuate it.
Should we go to the last one?
Yeah.
The last one, they talk about rumination. And they say, finally, rumination refers to a focus of attention on the symptoms of one's distress and its possible causes and consequences rather than its possible solutions.
Exactly.
I'm triggered.
Yeah, really. The whole thing about triggered. I mean, it's like, geez, look for solutions, not for places to hide.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, this is to me, I mean, this whole thing is gendered, I think, which is not to say that there are not men who suffer from TIV.
Right.
But I think we all know more women who have tendencies that way than we know men. And this final one, this notion of rumination, going over one's experience and sort of treasuring up the ways in which one has been wounded, the ways in which one has been badly done to, and not looking at solutions. And often this is a focus of disagreement between men and women, because a woman will say, listen to this, let me tell you about, you know, the terrible things that I've experienced that have been done to me. And the man will say, okay, well, you could fix it by doing this, or you could do this instead, or whatever.
How dare you?
Yeah, how dare you? I don't want it. No, I don't want to fix it. I just, you know, I just want to experience
I want you to be transfixed by my victimhood.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
Oh,
yeah,
God.
yeah. I mean, that it's so useful to see that actually named as part of this personality disorder. I have a friend who became involved in men's issues, and he's tried to approach feminists, especially on Facebook, saying he brings good news. And the good news is that things aren't nearly as bad as feminists make them out to be. And so he articulates that he's bringing the gospel of good news about feminism, that it's lying to women, but women are not happy to learn that.
Not.
You know, they don't want to learn that the statistics are wrong, or that things are much better for women than they've been told they are, because and that's the one thing that I thought was sort of missing in a way in this discussion, is the deep pleasure that comes from this particular disorder. I don't think that's mentioned once in the outline of the personality type. That it's not just, I mean, they emphasize that these people have low self-esteem. They talk about how they have, perhaps this originates in, I think what they called attachment disorders, or faulty attachment in personal life. And you know, that's a whole other issue, is how this starts. But I think that part of the problem is that it feels really good to believe oneself a victim, and therefore morally superior, and therefore not responsible, and therefore not, or you know, capable of taking revenge without feeling guilty for that. You know, all of that gives a rush of euphoria.
Yep. Kicks in the endorphins.
And guys, one thing I want to say about this, I want to make sure this gets out before we stop talking. Look, crazy cannot hide. It can't. I talk to guys all the time, and I've been a guy who said, after a really terrible relationship experience, I had no way of knowing. It was like it came out of the blue. What bullshit was I spouting? It doesn't come out of the blue. Craziness is apparent. If you're looking, if you've got values and standards, and you understand stuff like TIV, then you know when somebody comes out with way too much information and it's all about victimhood very early in meeting them, they will come out with it. That's part of the rumination, is that TIV is TMI. And you see this and you do nothing, because while men are infatuated, while all of us are infatuated, we tend to overlook negatives in the other one. We tend not to see things because we want to rush to have sex every 5 minutes. But the sad fact of the matter is that nobody steps on a mine without the opportunity of knowing that they're in a minefield. And so, guys, in the spirit of this discussion, you have to take the onus. You have to take responsibility for the fact that you're screening people for your own safety. And
you are in a minefield.
Yes, you are in a minefield in the world in general. So you always have to have your eyes open. But there aren't really real victims of people with TIV. I'd argue. I think that they have volunteered. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, you know, one of the biggest disappointments I had with this study was that they did not do a gender breakdown or a sex breakdown.
They didn't dare.
I think that's right. I'm going to write to the researcher. I'm going to ask if they did any kind of breakdown with that, because they knew who the females and males were. So it'd be simple to look at the data and get a sense of what happened. Because I'm sure, I mean, when you look at moral typecasting and precarious manhood, both of those predict very clearly that those who are going to be centering on victimhood are more likely to be female than male.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think that that's probably the case, but the research didn't come out and say that.
Yeah.
For good reason, probably, Paul.
What sort of bias at play there when you've got in the entire profession, its bread and butter is making victims of people.
Right. There you go.
And so, like, how you get a fair gender spread? I mean, it's interesting because this is the only pathology that I'm aware of that seems to be rampant in the profession that's studying it.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
That's the thing.
That's the thing.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And so, and the question that's raised by this study is, okay, now that this personality type has been identified, what are we supposed to do about it? Like, can it be treated? If it's I mean, how do you convince somebody that they aren't a victim, or that the, you know, or that they're treasuring up of their victimhood, they're basing their whole notion of self on that idea, that that's actually detrimental to them. You know,
just like any other pathology that's new on the scene, one of the first things that can happen is simply to point it out. And guys, read the study, read the article, and when she pulls something like this, just ask her, do you have a case of TIV? You know, or just put it out there. Put it out. Is this TIV? Have you heard of TIV before? And then the discussion happens. Then you can talk about it, and then you'll find out whether she's got it or not. You know, but that's the first thing that can happen, is to make it a part of your awareness and a part of her awareness too. You know,
best advice of the day, right there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, good point, Tom. And I mean, I like the fact that the study emphasizes that having TIV is not necessarily antecedent to actually having had any experience of victimhood whatsoever.
Right.
You can. I mean, you know, there are real victims out there in the sense of people who've suffered terrible traumas or terrible injustices.
Yes.
But there are also people who believe themselves to be victims who've had absolutely no victimhood experience whatsoever. And I think that's useful to know as well, because I think the tendency of a lot of people, normal people, especially probably men relating to women, is that if you're told, you know, if you meet a woman who very convincingly tells you that she's suffered a great deal, she's suffered from the trauma of being victimized as female, a lot of guys are going to tend to think that even if it's overstated, there must be some kernel of truth to it.
Right. And there might be.
And there might be, but this study makes it clear that there is no necessary correlation at all between this victimhood identity and any actual experience of victimhood. And I think that's very useful to keep in mind as well.
And important. This is a mindset, not a reality.
It also pointed out that just because an individual had childhood trauma doesn't mean that they end up conversely with TIV, which makes sense. You know, we see this a lot in dealing with borderlines. You'd be very hard pressed to find a borderline female who doesn't claim some sort of sexual abuse in her past. It's always there. But even though they don't want to talk about it too much, and I forget where the research came from, but there is indications that that's not always the case, that sometimes with borderlines, the stories of sexual abuse are manufactured.
Really?
Because it fits the victim narrative.
Yes, it does.
But I think this is probably to some degree present in almost all personality disorders.
You mean the TIV?
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
I mean, just a wild guess, but
except for sociopath.
Except for sociopath.
No victim.
And no victim there.
The vengeance part's there, but
and probably not so much with true narcissists, but with others. I think we'd probably see something to that effect.
To me, the TIV is basically a depressed narcissist. You know, it's like they're depressed. It's like they think very poorly of themselves. The narcissists think they're the best thing in the world, and the TIV people think they're the worst victim ever. So, but they have similar characteristics other than that, you know. Oh boy.
Yeah.
Well, they think they're the worst victim ever, and then on the inside, as is stated in the research, they really feel like they're better than everybody.
Yeah.
Part of this is an overinflated. I always find it curious when people talk about, well, we see low self-esteem. Not so much. I'm not buying that. What we see a lot of times with codependents, with victims, and that their sense of self is way overinflated. They have identified as martyrs. And how can you be a martyr if you have low self-esteem? It just doesn't fit.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. The other thing about the study, of course, it is not a historical analysis, so it doesn't talk about whether this issue of TIV is becoming worse, or whether it's more dominant now in our society at large than it was 50 years ago. I mean, certainly I feel like it's becoming worse, and I think that was your theme, Tom, in the opening. It just seems like, I don't know, when I don't remember this when I went to school. I do not remember in the 1970s really the idea of the holy victim. The victims were to be referred to, the victims were special, that they were sacred, that they had knowledge all the rest of us should respect. It seems like it has developed in the last 40 years, and especially in the last 15 to 20 years, it has just exploded. And so it would be interesting. Well, I'm sure I know there's been interesting books on the rise of victimhood as an ideology and as something that our culture valorizes in irrational ways. And yeah, it certainly does seem that there's a cultural component to it, because I do not believe that in the 19th century, when people were preoccupied in North America with just settling the land and building cities, and
feeding themselves.
Feeding themselves.
Yeah.
This was not, you did not have people sitting around ruminating on their victimhood and dwelling on their moral superiority as a result of it. There have been times in history when to be a victim was actually a source of shame rather than a valorization.
Yes.
So there's got to be a very strong cultural component creating this, and that's
there
just another
and there still is a sense of shame in being a victim for men.
Correct.
Yeah. That's a rule that still applies, and I'm thinking that there's got to be a direct correlation between the emergence and the flourishing of identity politics, and TIV,
and agency and patiency. Both of those are definitely connected. But there is some research on narcissism that shows that college students in particular dropped, I think it was like 40% of empathy between 1980 and 2010 or something like that. I forget the exact years, but they took the same test and gave the college students in 1980, gave the same one in 2000 something, and their scores dropped on things like, I understand the way my roommate does things, things like that, just basic understanding and empathy. They've got very little, it's dropping. It's dropping.
Wow. Yeah.
And that's the fathers being removed from homes.
What's that?
That's the fathers being removed from homes.
Yeah, no kidding. Sure. Isn't that the truth?
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's not get started.
So,
maybe something about father absence tied to TIV too.
That's interesting, Paul.
Lack of empathy.
I'll bet there is a connection. Boy, that'd be fascinating if they connected that.
Yeah.
That's
well,
true.
Lots of interesting avenues for further research if these people are willing and able to do it. Because again, I can't.
Career survives it.
They survived the nuclear blast.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't see this being well received in the psychology community in general.
Oh my God, this is like if this were openly and widely received, it would spell the end of psychotherapy as we know it.
Well, I don't know if I'd go that far, but it would certainly put a different spin on victimhood.
Yeah.
There's certainly a part of psychotherapy that is focused on identifying wounds, and I think that's still important for people to work on and work through. But and maybe I'm just jaded, Tom, because I see most Christians as so incompetent with this stuff. Or corrupt, because there are clinicians out there that intentionally keep people focused on victimhood because there's profit in it.
Right. And I think, that is the feminine path. It's the, I'll nurture, I'll have compassion, and I'll hold, and a poor victim, whereas the masculine path is something very different. He says, yeah, man, that hurt. What the fuck can you do about it now?
Yeah.
What can you do now? Where can we go?
What do you want to do with the pain? What do you want to do with the anger? What do you want to do constructively with this stuff?
And I've noticed over the years, men naturally go in that direction. It's not something they have to be taught to do. They've already done it, But I'm biased. I think men are good.
Well,
God. Are we finished?
Yeah, on that note.
Man,
TID, it's a word to remember.
Indeed.
It is. Are
men good?
Yes. For crying out loud, they're good. You all take care.
Have a good week.
We'll see you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Happy holidays.